Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and patch 11.1 is finally here. Or hopefully at least it'll be live a little bit later over in the NA region. But with a brand new seasonal update, we got also a ton of class changes, and that's exactly what I want to go over today. The entire list of patch notes for every single class change happening for the patch 11.1. Now there's going to be a huge number of tuning, like damage buffs and nerfs all across the board over these next few weeks, especially as we get into the new raiding, PvP, and Mythic Plus season in just a week. So I primarily want to focus this update on all the new things like talents, abilities, and anything major happening with classes. If there are some major talent reworks or damage reworks, I will talk about them, but I won't go through all the nitty-gritty little details like 5% damage for a Obliterate here, 2% damage for a Backstab there. I mostly want to focus on the major changes that you can expect for every single class heading into the patch 11.1. I'm also going to leave chapter marks down below because it's a long video. All the classes are in alphabetical order. As always, if you guys want to see more regular updates for the patch 11.1, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. So I'll primarily focus these changes in terms of alphabetical order, and I'll try to cover the specs also in alphabetical order, but I'll first go over the general changes, then spec-specific changes, hero talent changes, as well as PvP changes towards the tail end. But the first thing I wanted to note is general set of passive survivability nerfs for both Frost and Unholy. Certain talents are getting downgraded a little bit because Death Knight survivability in PvE has been deemed a little bit too good, and maybe they were having way too much fun. So things like Veteran of Third War gets downgraded from a 20% stamina down to 12, and from 10% down to 6 within PvP. Things like Null Magic has also been reduced from 8% magic reduction down to 5, or from 4% down to 3 within PvP. And talents like Permafrost will grant you auto attack damage, will grant you an absorb shield equal to 30% of your damage dealt, used to be 40% within PvE content. You still have access to a lot of your unused defenses like Icebound Fortitude as well as Lichborn, so you still have active damage mitigations, but the passive mitigations is what's getting reduced for both Frost and Unholy. For Blood Death Knight, we're not seeing a lot of changes. They're primarily just getting a tank buff, and every single tank receives a buff heading into Season 2 to make sure, one, their damage continues to be relevant in content like raids, dungeons, open world, but also it does help out with managing aggro a little bit more. Like if you want to spec for a more defensive build, you will still have a bit more bite to your abilities, so it might be a little bit easier for you to maintain aggro against burst classes that can just get snap aggro very, very quickly. Blood Death Knight damage gain is 20%, which is quite significant. Not a lot of changes to your builds, but you just do a little more damage, which does make it a little more relevant. As for the specs of Frost and Unholy, you're not really seeing a lot of new things, mostly damage tuning. Frost gets a lot of your basic abilities, core abilities like Obliterate, Frost Strike, all those things tuned up a little bit. Same thing with Unholy, mostly just damage tuning, which I don't want to harp on too much because tuning is going to continue on over these next few weeks. They did end up also getting new tier sets, which are going to be probably the most impactful aspects of either one of these two specs. When it comes to PvP changes, Frost Death Knights are getting a new talent called Death's Cold Embrace. Pillar of Frost grants you Remorseless Winter and increases its damage by 750%, its radius by 150, but your movement speed is heavily reduced for the duration. It means you're going to be incredibly slow, but every time you pop Pillar of Frost, you're just dealing a ton of AoE damage to every target around you. It also does add 15 seconds on the cooldown of Pillar of Frost, so you can only use it once a minute, but it gives you incredibly strong AoE damage as a Frosty Death Knight combined with your Chain of Ice and your grips. Is going to make it very, very difficult for enemies to escape your Death's Cold Embrace. When it comes to Demon Hunters, we are seeing some generalized quality of life improvements, primarily to the ability of Spectral Sight. This ability, while it doesn't have a lot of consequential uses outside of PvP content, it is a unique mechanic that allows Demon Hunters to see stealthy and invisible enemies, mostly players, so they improve the ability by quite a bit. Spectral Sight is no longer removed upon taking damage or whenever you use abilities. It only can be removed by either being dispelled by a class that can remove magic effects or by being crowd controlled. Also, movement penalty cost whenever you use Spectral Sight has also been reduced down to 20%. But with the talent of Lost in Darkness, you can now actually gain a little bit longer duration, or shorter cooldown rather, of Spectral Sight, and it no longer reduces movement speed, which can make it that much easier for you to catch off stealthy classes within content like PvP. Also, abilities like for Havoc Demon Hunters at least, activating Vengeful Retreat will now enforce a brief cooldown on abilities like Fellblade, but also changes Fellblade so it's able to cancel mid-air Vengeful Retreats, so you're able to Vengeful Retreat into Fellblade a little bit more smoothly without flying all over the room. This makes it a little bit easier for Demon Hunters who didn't like to Vengeful Retreat and then Fell Rush back in, so now you can use Vengeful Retreat and then Fell Rush back in for a much more smoother mobility transition. As for the hero talents, Felskard's gotten a couple updates, like the Demon Surge ability now has a soft target cap. Used to be previously uncapped, dealing fire damage to every enemy, but not anymore. This damage is now reduced beyond 8 targets, so it's a little bit of a downgrade in AoE, but as long as you're not fighting more than 8 targets, it should still do its full damage. The damage of Demon Surge has been increased a little bit to compensate, but there's also other talent changes within Havoc and Demon Hunter that might make you want to stray away from Demon Surge as an ability. The talent of Burning Blades has gotten a little bit stronger, however. Now it deals 50% of the listed ability damage over 6 seconds, which makes it a little better. And then Flame Bound now increases Immolation Aura's critical damage by 50% to potentially synergize with some of those Immolation Aura type builds. But then we also got updates for the Eldrachi Reaver. I've actually heard people pronounce it Eldrachi. There is a short questline in the Vegas Demon Hunter Order Hall that I went and played through just to find out how to say the name of this ability, because you pick up the Eldrachi Warglaives, and in the questline they call it the Eldrachi. I hear Eldrachi a lot, but I know there's just one questline that says specifically exactly how you pronounce it, so I wouldn't blame anybody for getting it wrong. It looks like Eldrachi, doesn't it? But they ended up buffing up the Wounded Quarry passive. Now, to make it a little bit better for AoE and cleave damage, whenever you expose the weakness of a target with Reaver's Mark, causing all your physical damage to any enemy to also deal a portion of that damage back to your marked target as pure chaos damage, and sometimes shatter unless it's soul fragments. They did end up nerfing Eldrachi and some of the interactions within Wounded Quarry, as well as your Art of the Glaive and some of the double dipping, which is going to have some significant damage losses, but this isn't fairly new and a good talent that allows you to cleave damage off of all targets around you back into Reaver's Mark target, giving you focus and priority damage, which should be very strong in content like raids, but also specifically Mythic Plus dungeons, and should increase cleavability of Demon Hunters everywhere. Now, with Havoc specifically, we got some major updates. Enemy's necessary talent is gone, so you can no longer convert Fire, Chaos, or Fire, Arcane, Frost, and other type of nature damage abilities back into Chaos. So, which makes your mastery a little bit less effective, but also things that deal pure fire damage like Demon Surge a little bit less effective. So with that being gone, it's going to make a pretty big shift in terms of your stats and resources as a Havoc Demon Hunter going forward. They did end up amping up your mastery a little, but with Enemy's Necessary gone, it does make a pretty big impact in terms of what abilities can now be converted to Chaos and which ones don't. Even things like Immolation Aura, which can be made into Chaos, but things like your Fellblade, fire damage, your Sigil Flame, also fire damage, so some of those things are just not going to be able to convert nearly as easily. Replacing Enemy's Necessary is going to be a talent called Screaming Brutality, which is a tier set from Dragonflight. Blade Dance automatically triggers throw a glaive on your primary target for 100% of the damage, and each slash has a 50% chance to throw a glaive at an enemy for 35% of the damage. This is considered as with certain other talents that all but throw a glaive, while Soul Scholar, it does make glaive-based builds just a little bit better. Also, they've updated the talent of Cycle of Hatred, turning it down from a 2-point to a 1-point talent point cost that allows you, whenever you use I-Beam, to reduce the cooldown of all future I-Beams, stack it up to 20 seconds, and gives you pretty massive cooldown reduction for your I-Beam. And this buff lasts with you for a long while, even in between combat situations like in dungeons, so you should be able to hold on to this buff for a very long time, even in content like Mythic Plus. As for Vegas Demon Hunters, as a tank, it also saw a damage buff increase of 20% additional damage all across the board. But it also saw a couple other benefits as well. Demon Spikes now has a duration of 8 seconds, up from 6 seconds, so they last a little bit longer. Cycle of Binding has also been adjusted as well, which only now procs from your Sigil Flame, used to be all of your sigils, and reduces the cooldown by 2 seconds. Now Sigil Flame reduces the cooldown of other sigils by 5 seconds, so it has a little bit of a different interaction. Feed the Demon has also been adjusted down to a single talent point cost, where consuming a soul fragment now reduces the remaining cooldown of Demon Spikes by 0.35 seconds, which makes it a little bit easier to access things like Last Resort, or potentially head into other directions when it comes to your talent tree, depending on how you optimize your builds. And when it comes to PvP content, having Demon Hunter gains access to Illidan's Grasp, which replaces your Fell Eruption, basically allowing you to stun an enemy, dealing a bunch of shadow damage over 5 seconds, but also letting you then throw that target in a direction within 20 yards. This is going to give Demon Hunters quite a bit of extra control, especially good in content like BG Blitz, but can also be really good at repositioning enemies to a much better position for your team within content like solo shuffles. When it comes to the class of the Druid, we're seeing a massive talent tree rework, which Druids have been waiting for one for a very long time. You will notice there's a lot more connections between all of these different points in your talent tree that allow you to start at the top left and make it all the way to the bottom right a little bit easier, or vice versa, and it gives you a little bit more flexibility. One of the things you'll notice is a lot of the strong utilitarian talents that are shared among specs can be found in the top rows of the talent tree and are much easier to spec into. Even things like where Light of the Sun is for balance would be a Skull Bash for the other specs, making it a little bit easier for you to pick up things like your Interrupt while picking up a lot of your core based abilities, and even give you some alternative options like Renewal or like a passive version that does a very similar effect and things like that. There's even an upgraded version of Well-Honed Instincts with perfectly honed instincts, and even some modifications towards the bottom rows of your talent tree as well. One of the things you'll notice is some adjustments with some brand new choices like Lakara's Meditation or Symbiotic Relationship, change up where Fluid Form could be found, we're starting Vigor, but also a new option of either Cycle of the Heavens, Circle of the Heavens, or Circle of the Wild. This one is going to be a little bit more impactful for rest of Druid than the other specs, but for the rest of them it's about a 5% gain of magic damage or physical damage, which gives you some hybrid capabilities. For Restoration, it's like a 20% damage increase, where Rester will have to actually have a choice between more physical damage or a lot more magic damage, but they don't really need to do both at the same time, or they're less inclined to have to do both, which allows them to better customize their builds going forward. Also, every single Druid spec has gotten a variety of different damage buffs, but also some new talents that previously weren't natively learned by the spec. Like, Balanced Druids can pick up Moonkid Form immediately without having to invest a talent point into it, while Feral Druids can pick up abilities like Thrash also without having to talent points into it either, which saves you on a talent point cost and allows you to optimize your builds just a little bit better. Like all the other tanks, Guardian also gains a damage buff, but theirs is actually up to 25%. 20 just for being a tank, and 5% from another bonus, but roughly amounts to about 25% more damage heading into this new update. We also get some new talents like your Ursul's Warding, which allows you to gain magical damage reduction equal to a portion, either 5% or 10% of your overall armor. And the more Iron Forge you stack up, which increases your armor, also causes Ursa Warding to also grow in power as well, which is going to be quite impactful. The talent of Reinvigoration have also been adjusted, allowing your friends in the region to heal you for either 1 or 2 seconds longer, but also depending on how many talent points you invest into, you'll also cast Rejuvenation and Regrowth on yourself at either 100 or 200% effectiveness, offering a little bit more of those hybrid benefits. Also, the talent of Raise has been adjusted to replace Maul again, like it did back in Dragonflight, although they're a little bit more, at least they're a little bit better implemented with the new version of Raise. Raise keeps the strong physical single target damage of Maul, so you don't lose out on single target damage, but you will now do cleave damage to all other targets. So you will still have big, high priority damage to a singular foe, which just basically replaces the button, allowing you to do the same thing, but just in a single keybind, instead of having one for Maul, one for Raise, which makes Guardian just a little bit easier to play into. As a Restoration Druid, you learn Improved Nature's Cure Baseline, which gives you that free curse removal and poison removal on top of your Nature's Cure, allowing you to cure magic, poison, and curse, which I think every spec should probably have. As like I said with Druid Restoration, they are going to have a bit more impact with Circle of the Wild and Circle of the Heavens, increasing the magic damage or physical damage by 25%. So you can Cat Weave or you can Owl Weave, but you're not really encouraged to do both. You're really encouraged to spec into one of them and make that one super impactful, but it really just comes down to whether you Cat Weave with Wildstalker or Owl Weave with Keeper of the Grove. Outside of this, your Mastery has also been improved by a decent bit, increasing its effectiveness by 30% overall, though this effectiveness does get reduced for every healing of a temp present on your target. The fact that Restoration Druids had to layer their hearts on a single ally before they became effective, but if you were playing like a big Rejuve build where you just put one single heart, they wanted that healing over time effect to also be effective. So a single healing over time is going to be 30% more effective, though layering healing over time is still going to be better than a single heal overall. It's just there's going to to be less of a gap between a one hot or multiple hots on a target. Things like Nature Swiftness now buff up the healing of your regrowth by 200% up from 100%, making it a better burst heal. And also buttons such as Flourish have gotten a little bit better, with Flourish now healing all allies that are effects for a decent bit of healing split evenly amongst them, making it a much better burst healing button than content like 5-man content or 2-man, 3-man content, but a little bit less of a burst heal in content like Raid specifically. Also, the talent of Master Shapeshifter now is going to provide you 30% less mana from caster form spells, which is a little bit unfortunate, but they have been doing a little bit of mana adjustment for multiple classes. Rest of Druids was not the only one that was affected by some mana management. As for the Druid PvP talents, we have a new version of Thorns, which now procs automatically whenever you cast Barkskin or Ironbark, allowing you to add Thorns to that target, which means you can't really put a Thorns on somebody else as a Feral Druid, Balanced Druid, or a Guardian Druid. Rest of Druids also get access to a brand new incarnation tree, Ancient of Lore, shapeshifting you into this massive tree that makes you immune to crowd control abilities, reduces damage taken, and grants you access to 2 new abilities, a Blossom Burst and Mass Blooming. With Blossom Burst, you heal an ally for a ton and apply a heal over time effect on that ally. If all hots are active, Blossom Burst always critically heals. With Mass Blooming, you heal 5 allies for a bunch and apply 1 single missing heal over time effect, so it basically gives you 2 buttons that you can spam endlessly to mass heal all of your allies. Another PvP talent, also for Resto, called Forest Guardian, allows you Wrath, Starfire, Cyclone, and Calm Point generating abilities to extend the duration of your active hots by 1 second on up to 3 allies, allowing you to play a little bit more aggressively while maintaining all of your heals. Abilities like Star Surge and Calm Point spending abilities like Bite or Rip or Maim increase the rate at which your heals over time are effective by 20% for 4 seconds, which again allows you to be a little bit more aggressive as a Resto Druid with you caster or a cat weaving variety. From there we got the class of Evoker. Starting with some of the general changes, we really just have one that's noteworthy. The ability of Rescue is now going to start clearing movement impairing effects from you and the ally that you rescue, which actually was a buff used to have in Season 1, then they removed it, but brought back for Season 2, so I guess that's nice. The one thing they really wanted to change up when it comes to Evoker is the playstyle of Flame Shaper for both Devastation and Preservation. Basically, they were looking to improve that playstyle for dungeon content, where instead of increasing the duration and spreading of your Fire Breath or Dream Breath, depending if you're DPS or a healer, Flame Shaper can now cast those abilities more often, so you're able to use your breath abilities a lot more aggressively, and have those abilities deal more damage or healing in a much more condensed window. Where you have things like Enkindle now on the same row as Expanded Lungs, which have been shifted. You now have Fulminous Roar no longer competing with any other talent, just someone you have access to at all times. And also Consume Flame no longer consumes your flame by 4 seconds or more, it just consumes 2 seconds but detonates it at a much greater impact, so you don't have to lose out and have those breath abilities, Fire Breath or Dream Breath, run out a little bit too quickly to try to make Flame Shaper a little bit more competitive. As for Devastation Evoker, they're making some new changes to a variety of their talents with things like Azure Celerity, which allows you Disintegrate to tick 1 additional time, having it 4 ticks or 5 ticks every time you channel it, but the ability does do a little bit less damage. It does play around with the cooldown reduction aspect of Devastation, however, to get some of your empowerment abilities back a little bit quicker. Things like Scorching Embers have also been buffed up, which now allows your damage to scale with empowerment level up to 40% maximum with max empowerment of Fire Breath, which can give you a very big burst window to overlap with some of your other base abilities. The ability of Firestorm is getting another buff up by a significant bit, increasing its damage by 50%, but also reducing its duration down to 6 seconds, so it deals its full damage in a much shorter time. And abilities like Eternity Surge are now going to, instead of picking a target that's near your target, just target any enemy that's within 25 yards of the Evoker. So it's probably going to cleave enemies a little bit differently, but you're more likely, depending on your position, to hit multiple enemies that you're kind of near. They also greatly empowered the damage of both your Fire Breath and Eternity Surge, and they want to adjust Scintillation a little bit to trigger off of Eternity Surge at 40% power instead of 50, but with the base and buffs to Eternity Surge, it should make very, very little difference. Or I guess not very little, some difference, but not as much as you would think. As for preservation, we're not seeing too many changes, mostly an adjustment to Dream Breath ability, which will always heal you and 5 nearby allies. This is primarily to make sure the Dream Breath doesn't have a weird interaction with Flame Shaper, where you try to proc your engulf off of yourself, and with Dream Breath always hitting you, it makes it a little bit easier to do so, plus it's just a little more consistent. Though Dream Breath and Reversion will no longer snapshot with your mastery. Every single time they tick, it always reevaluates your health and your mastery, and your mastery is an interesting one. It basically can increase your healing. If your health is higher than your allies, that healing on the ally could be a little bit higher, so it's always going to do a little bit of reevaluation every time it ticks. When it comes to augmentation, we got some buffs and some nerfs. We got a brand new talent called Rockfall, where upheaval reaches maximum empowerment level a little faster and has a chance to grant you Essence Burst. Then also we have Modes of Possibility, which now have a slightly higher chance to proc. But besides that, we're seeing a bunch of nerfs across the board. Initially, they wanted to adjust augmentation to be less mandatory in Mythic Plus content and push content by adjusting Might, so it no longer affects the tanks and the healers in your group, only the other DPS classes. Because of this though, they wanted to make sure Bite doesn't fall behind too much, so they brought in a passive buff called Closes Clutchmates. Initially, Closes Clutchmates was incredibly powerful, but then they nerfed it, so it's a lot weaker version than the original one, only buffing Might and Breath of Eons by 10% outside of raid content. Also, Breath of Eons, they ended up nerfing that one on top of it, used to accumulate 10% of damage dealt by allies, nerfed down to 8, though it doesn't reflect in tooltip at the moment. Also, their mastery of Shifting Sands, where you can grant an ally a buff of versatility. That versatility effectiveness is reduced by 20%. So it looks like augmentation, they're really trying to make sure it doesn't dominate the Mythic Plus meta, though I wouldn't be surprised if it continues to do so even as we head into this brand new update. As for Evokers within PvP content, the ability of Sleepwalk in PvP no longer has a cooldown, so you can spam it as much as you want to, which makes it a little bit easier for you to use it and a little more aggressively to set up a cross kill or just to crowd control an enemy healer. Also, Seismic Slam becomes a PvP talent, where Landslide causes any enemies who are mid-air to be slammed back to the ground, stunning them for 4 seconds. Landslide's cooldown is also reduced by 15 seconds. This one is a little bit easier to line up as augmentation because you can knock enemies up and then slam them. As the other two specs, it's a little bit difficult, but you might be able to have some cross-slam capability with classes like Mages or Hunters with a knock-up into a slam if you can coordinate correctly. Now, when it comes to the class of Hunter, there's a variety of changes, from general changes, but also massive reworks for us to go over. Starting with some of the most general changes, there's a lot of class talents in the Hunter challenge tree that just don't get a lot of play and a lot of usefulness, so they're trying to amp him up just a little to make him a little bit better, just to give him just a nice little bonus to make it worth picking up. So things like Kindling Flare now will increase the flare's radius by 50%, might be useful in content like PvP, for instance. The talent of Territorial Instincts has been redesigned just to reduce the cooldown of Intimidation without summoning a bonus pet. The talent of Wilderness Medicine, which is mostly used to heal your pet, now actually has a bonus for Exhilaration, giving it a little bit better cooldown reduction, which could be good for your own self-survivability. The ability of Explosive Shot simply just has a faster traveling projectile, so you can reach the target and do its damage a little bit faster. That's just a bonus overall. And abilities like Freeze and Trap will now break not to immediate damage, but to a damage threshold, which can be good in content like PvP, if let's say you accidentally hit an enemy, you don't want to break the CC, but also has some niche uses within content like dungeons or maybe even open world content. Then we got adjustments to hero specs specifically, with the Dark Ranger Withering Fire playstyle no longer proccing free Black Arrow uses. You actually now have to cast Black Arrows whenever you're playing the Dark Ranger to get access of Withering Fire. It's no longer something that happens passively. As for the hero spec of Pack Leader, this one has been redesigned greatly. It's very similar for BM and Survival, but just a couple of talents have been adjusted. Pack Leader now plays around the ability of Howl of the Pack Leader, where in combat every 25 seconds, you cast Kill Command to summon either a Wyvern, increasing your damage in combat, a Boar to charge past your targets dealing physical damage, or a Bear that becomes a combat pet that joins you in combat after dealing a bunch of damage to allies and then continue to fight for you for a short bit of time. With Pack Mentality, Howl of the Pack Leader can buff up one of your basic abilities, and summoning a beast also gives you cooldown reduction either for your Barb Shots as BM or Wildfire Bombs as Survival. Abilities like Kill Command, Cobra Shot, or Raptor Strike help reduce the cooldown of Howl of the Pack, so you can use it more aggressively, summoning more beasts in combat. With Better Together, how the pet cooldown is reduced normally from 30 seconds down to 25, and your pet gains additional attack power. You can also modify your bear, your wyvern, and your boar in a variety of ways. For bear, you have a couple of options. The bear can either consume all of your serpent strings to deal damage, or the periodic damage is the chance to reduce the cooldown of your kill command by a few seconds. With Fury of the Wyvern, your pet attacks and your basic attacks are increased by a bonus from your Wyvern stacking, and casting Kill Command extends the duration of your Wyvern by up to additional 10 seconds. Either Kill Command for BM, but I'm pretty sure it's Wildfire Bomb for survival. With a Hawk Strider, the boar when it charges in, depending how many enemies it charges through, it either causes your Cobra Shot to cleave or your Raptor Strike to cleave to nearby targets. For Survival Hunter in particular, it actually refreshes your Mungus Fury buff, which allows Mungus Bite to become a viable playstyle. Though even if you don't want to play Mungus Bite, you can still play Raptor Strike and then do massive cleaves with those every time the board charges through. You can also empower your pets with the ability of Kill Shot, sending him into a rage. Also causes your pet to use their basic combat ability, which makes Kill Shot an interactive button that you'll want to press. You also get a defensive with Shell Cover, giving you a slight damage reduction every 1.5 minutes whenever you drop to low on health, and a couple of utility options between Horsehair Tether and Select Shoes. With a capstone, casting Bestial Wrath or Coordinated Assault grants you Howl of the Pack Leader, which allows you to summon one beast after the next. This buff also increases the damage of your beast, being specifically the wyvern, boar, or even better, the bear, but also buffs up your own pets by a decent bit as well. And finally, we have the Sentinel, where it primarily worked on buffing up the ability of Lunar Storm, which has been changed by quite a bit. The ability has gotten a significant damage increase of about 25% from Season 1. It now has a 12-yard radius, which is a little bit longer, a slightly longer duration of 12 seconds, but now it procs every 30 seconds, so you don't get it as often, but it's a lot more impactful when it does proc. It also moves with your target very slowly, so it no longer is stationary, but will track with your current target and try to move with them as best as possible. It's got a new visual, and the ability now kind of reminds me of the Wild Spirit's ability from the expansion of Shadowlands the hunters used to have from the Arden Wield or the Night Fae Covenant. It's not quite as strong as Wild Spirits, but it's very, very reminiscent of it with this set of changes. From there, Beastmaster Hunter got a number of changes as well. They got a new talent called Dire Cleave, where you summon Dire Beast now also have Beast Cleave, making Dire Beast a lot more effective, but they've adjusted the proc rate of your Dire Beast a little bit because this talent was kind of running out of control for a good bit on PTR. Also, Dire Beasts, when they get summoned, have a new animation. They now leap onto your target instead of just kind of running to them, so they get to the target quicker, and it looks a little bit more visceral, like they're charging for the target's throat. It looks awesome. Big fan of this little adjustment. There's a new talent called Poison Barbs, where direct damage from Barb Shot now has the chance to explode, spreading Serpent Sting to multiple targets, and the damage of Serpent Sting has been significantly increased as well. And now with Pack Leader, there's even interaction with spreading Serpent Stings to multiple targets, which is kind of interesting. Beastmaster Hunters also have the option of either running dual Animal Companion or Solitary Companion. So if you want to run with a one pet for flavor instead of two, you can have that pet do additional damage and be a little larger. They said themselves to want to keep the damage changes or the damage numbers between Solitary Companion and Animal Companion to be really close to each other. I am not sure if they're going to be able to achieve it, but if they do, then hunters might be able to just go with a single pet for flavor alone, but we'll have to wait and see. I'm thinking Animal Companion is probably going to be a little stronger, but if they can get the damage very, very close to each other, definitely something to keep up with and might be a flavor option going forward. Outside of this, Beastmaster capstone of Dark Ranger has been adjusted. The capstone of Withering Fire now procs whenever you cast Call of the Wild, which is pretty good. It feels a lot better than having to wait for 3 Bestial Wraths to get benefits out of it, and it makes the Dark Ranger playstyle feel super fun and engaging, especially with a proc it off of Call of the Wild, where you summon a bunch of pets and you can get a lot more cleave for those pets with things like Hunter's Prey. This little adjustment makes Dark Ranger like a lot more usable in a lot more fun of a way, because now you have a cooldown that you can send to guarantee procs of Dark Ranger, which I find kind of fun to experiment with. As for the spec of Marksmanship Hunter, we got a complete rework of talents. While we do have some familiar abilities like your aim shot, your rapid fire, precise shots, and a couple of cooldowns like your true shot, the rest of the kit of this class has been changed completely. First things first, Marksman Treasure Hunter baseline no longer has a pet. You can technically spec into it with a breakable bond to gain access to call pet back, and it is a decent pet to deal damage in outdoor content, but for the most part you are meant to be playing around with a spotter eagle. As you deal damage, or primarily whenever you consume precise shots, an eagle can swoop up from the sky to mark the target, making them take more damage from your aim shots. The eagle can also be used in order to stun your target with intimidation, and the eagle natively comes with the ability to bloodlust you and your allies, so marksmanship hunters gain bloodlust naturally. You can upgrade your eagle further with either tenacious in order to give yourself, and well, I guess only yourself, not really the eagle, more survivability options as you would with a tenacity pet, or cunning in order to get access to master's call, with the eagle taking advantage in getting a brand new role added to the bloodlust capability. And there's so many different talents that change up your gameplay, either to interact with your eagle or interact with your basic gameplay abilities, interact with your auto attacks, explosive shots, and there's so many different talents for you to take a look at. There's just way too much to cover. But the important things I'll note is the capstones are very different and offer a lot of difference in gameplay. One of the exciting talents for me is double tap, making a comeback. Casting true shot or volley now grants double tap, causing the next aim shot or rapid fire to fire, but at a slightly reduced effectiveness, but it's still just as effective as it was back in the day. And there's so many different talents that synergize together, either as Sentinel or as Dark Ranger, and there's just too many variations of builds to cover for marksmanship. So if you're someone who's coming back to marksmanship for the patch 11.1, now would be a good time to just go through every single one of your talents slowly but surely, or at least look up a couple of builds to get yourself started for the brand new update. But this one is definitely a lot to take a look at all at once, so take your time exploring marksmanship all over again. As for the spec of survival, not much change, but they are adjusting your gameplay a little bit. They are trying to reduce a little bit the cooldown or reduction and resets on your wildfire bomb through talents, but are empowering the damage of Raptor Strike a lot more. So in a way, they're giving Survival Hunter a bigger stick. They're also adjusting some of your talents and abilities to try to simplify your rotation a little bit. Not necessarily making your rotation easy, but it is right now a little bit bogged down with so many different globals that you have to use in order to get yourself started, and then trying to reduce the startup time that Survival sometimes has to play around with. Things like Butchery as well as Flank Strike are now on the same talent tree, and talents that modify both of those abilities function a little differently. With Frenzy Strikes, Flank Strike damage is increased, and Flank Strike now increases your auto attack speed, while Butchery gains a cooldown reduction on wildfire bombs in AoE. With things like Merciless Blow, both Flank Strike and Butchery apply a bleed with different effectiveness depending on which ability you're using. Also, for Survival Hunter, they did things to make the ability of Raptor Strike and Mongoose Bite a little bit more usable by improving some of the talents that function off of that, like how you can apply Surfacing using your Raptor Strike or Mongoose Bite. That damage is also being increased by 50% with Viper's Venom, but when spreading against a target with already a Surfacing active, it now spreads to 4 enemies rather than 2, making it a little bit easier for you to spread your poisons all over enemy targets to utilize talents like Outland Venom, for instance. They also are increasing a little bit more effectiveness with Kill Shot as an ability by adding Call the Herd. Kill Shot increases the damage your enemies take from your Unipet's bleed effects by 25%, and with the upgrade sound of Born to Kill, your chance to gain death blow is increased. The duration of Call the Herd is also increased by 2 seconds, and Call the Herd now additionally increases the damage taken from your kill shots by 25%, so if you have a very kill shot executor type of playstyle, maybe one that works together with Pack Leader, then now there could be some new synergies for Survival to take advantage of. When it comes to Hunter PvP talents, we got some new one. One that's available for all 3 specs is Explosive Powder. Bursting Shot now also knocks you back and snares enemies by additional 20%, which allows you to create a bit of a gap when you're trying to get away from the target, getting him away from you, but also knocking yourself back a little bit, adding you for some additional mobility. As a Beastmaster Hunter, you get a different version of Dire Basilisk, which now procs passively whenever you summon Call of the Wild. So it isn't a pet you gotta use a global for yourself, just every time you use Call of the Wild, you also get a Basilisk to slowly move towards the target while dealing some heavy auto attacks. As marksmanship, you get access to 2 new talents, one of them being Aspect of the Fox. Aim Shot may now be cast while moving during Aspect of the Cheetah, and the duration of the delayed effect for Aspect of the Cheetah is increased by 4 additional seconds, which gives you some movement while casting one of your hardest hitting abilities that can now be used within PvP. A new version of Sniper's Advantage has also been adjusted as well. True Shot and Volley both increase the range of all of your shots by 30% for the ability duration, which can give marksmanship a little bit extra range, especially useful in content like BG Blitz. From there we have the class of mages, and one of the things they did for mages is any effects of polymorph now break to damage threshold rather than instantly to any damage, which, like for some of the other classes, can be useful in both PvP but also in some PvE situations. Now, when it comes to mages, one of the biggest changes they did is to the hero spec of Frostfire, which affects both the spec of Frost as well as the spec of Fire. With Frostfire, they've adjusted it so abilities like X's Fire, or procs rather, of X's Fire and X's Frost can now stack up to 2 times, which changes the rotational capability where you no longer have to immediately consume those stacks, even if it breaks your entire rotation, which is kind of nice. Also, the damage of Frostfire burst from the X's Fire also deals significantly more damage for both the specs of Frost and Fire. However, Frostfire does lose some in terms of its capstone from Flash Freeze Burn, which allows your Combustion or Icy Veins to grant you the effects of Frostfire Empowerment. Previously, you would have other talents that would grant you this effect, like things such as your Time Anomaly as a Fire Mage or Frost Mage. Whenever you get a random proc of Combustion or Icy Veins, that would also contribute towards that passive proc from your spec tree, or even things like Sun King's Blessing, Combustion procs that you would get as Fire, used to contribute to Flash Freeze Burn, but not anymore. Flash Freeze Burn can now only proc by actively activating Combustion or Icy Veins, which downgrades Frostfire effectiveness for Fire, but not as much as for Frost, because it does give you a little bit of predictability when it comes to your rotation, but it is going to have an impact in the effectiveness of Frostfire generally. As for the spec of Arcane, we got a number of changes, but not anything crazy. We got a couple of adjustments and some shifting around within the talent tree, but for the most part it's staying mostly the same. We do get the War Within Season 1 tier set becoming the talent with Intuition. Casting a damage spell has a 5% chance to make a next Arcane Barrage deal 50% more damage and generate 4 Arcane Charges, which is a fairly strong button that makes Barrage a little bit stronger. We now have a new choice now between Reverberate or Amplification, and on the bottom left we now have a choice between either Big Brained or Arcane Tempo. Talents like Resonance only function whenever you hit other targets beyond the first, so they no longer buff your damage for hitting your priority target. Also, the bottom right of the talent tree has been adjusted by quite a bit. Anything below Prodigious Savant, specifically when it comes to Late Drinker, has been adjusted. Bottom right, we have Arcane Rebound. When Arcane Barrage hits more than 2 targets, it explodes for additional arcane damage to enemies within 10 yards of the primary target, adding a little bit of cleave damage. In the middle row, we have Aether Fragment, which can buff Intuition's damage up to from 50% up to 70%, making it hit even harder. Or you can go with things like Lay Set, where another percentage damage bonus is increased by 10%. Late Drinker has also been adjusted. Consuming Clear Casting has a 40% chance to make a next Arcane Blast Echo, repeating his damage at 70% effectiveness to the primary target and up to 4 nearby enemies. Though casting Touch of the Magic always grants you the Late Drinker effect, giving it a little bit more consistency. When it comes to the spec of Fire, for the most part they wanted to make sure that the ability of Fireball actually gets a little bit of play. So they're buffing the damage of Fireball a little bit, but they're also adding some more interaction for Fireball-based talents, while slightly reducing the proc rate of things like Phoenix Flames, as well as your Fire Blast through a number of different talents, which is going to slow down the rotation a little bit. But in my time spent with the Fire Mage, it doesn't feel as impactful, though it may feel very, very noticeable at the very beginning of Season 2 before you get your Season 2 raid gear and your new tier set, which definitely helps speed up its gameplay. As for the ability of Fireball, you'll find it now baked into a variety of other talents like Master of the Flame, which gives Fireball and Ignite additional damage outside of Combustion, but also things like Controlled Destruction, which allows Fireball to add towards the additional Ignite damage stacks. Lastly, for Mage, they also adjusted Sun King's Blessing in terms of its overall value, nerfing it a little bit, but also buffing up Unleash Inferno by quite a decent bit. And with the new tier set that's coming out for Fire Mages, it looks like they're gravitating towards potentially Unleash Inferno. There may be some playability for Sun King's Blessing, but just be aware, Unleash Inferno now has been beefed up quite a bit, and has an interaction where it actually might be seen play going forward. When it comes to Frost Mages, they wanted to make sure that your ability of Blizzard is a little bit more effective. They increased its damage but pulled back on it a little bit, but they did leave the ability having a bit of a longer duration and a little bit of a longer yard range. So you're not going to have to refresh the ability of Blizzard nearly as aggressively, but for a little bit mages were using it in pure single target. That has for the most part been solved and reduced, so you no longer have to do so. to use Blizzard in a boss fight. Also, they've adjusted some of the proc rates and proc munching when it comes to your Frost Mage. The ability of Flurry applies Winter Chill on target, treating it as if it's frozen. But casting certain abilities can proc you Fingers of Frost, treating your Ice Lances that hit the target, treating that target as frozen. And when you have a lance, but also an enemy with a Winter Chill, normally you just munch both of these procs together, which do exactly the same thing. But Frost Mages are no longer going to be munching on those procs. So a Ice Lance that's empowered with Fingers of Frost will no longer consume the Winter's Chill buff, which allows you to get a lot more value out of your buff of Winter's Chill, but also things like your Fingers of Frost. This is going to change the rotation of your Frost Mage by quite a bit, but also will have to have you be a little bit on your toes regarding managing all of these debuffs and buffs to make sure that you're getting full value out of them, but you no longer can lose value on either one, which I think is a pretty nice change. You also adjusted the talent of Winter Tide, where damage from Frostbolt and Flurry increases the damage of either your Icicles or Glacial Spike. Stacking is just some decent little passive that at some point was consumed by abilities, but they just made it just something that just kind of procs automatically. As for the Mage PvP talents, we got a brand new one called Overpowered Barrier, which grants you barriers 100% more absorb, but only has these barriers last for 5 seconds. And each barrier for Fire, Frost, and Arcane does a different effect, depending on if it gets absorbed or not. For your Frost, Ice Barrier, if the barrier is fully absorbed, enemies within 10 yards will suffer additional frost damage and are slowed significantly for 4 seconds. For Fire Mages, that Blazing Barrier now reflects 100% of the damage absorbed, and now can be used as like a damage spell reflect. So if an enemy is just blasting you full of burst, you can now use Overpowered Barrier to reflect the damage back at the target, which I think is going to be quite good, especially if you can use it on an enemy that's popping all of the cooldowns into you while you're combusting right back into their face. And with Archimage, if the barrier is fully absorbed, your next blink or shimmer within 15 seconds will grant you invisibility and immunity to damage for 3 seconds, giving you a much easier time to try to escape your target or reposition in a better spot. Outside of this, talents like Ring of Fire now replace Ring of Frost. Ring of Frost freezes your enemies in place. Ring of Fire will disorient your enemies that enter it. So it's less of a damaging ability, but more of a disruption ability that can use on multiple targets, with the burn effect greatly reduced. In PvP content, Mage's Alter Time is now being impacted by things like dampening within PvP and arenas, which means that your healing is going to get reduced the longer a match goes on, which is a little bit unfortunate. For Arcane Mages, they did remove your Temporal Shield PvP talent, which again impacts your survivability, but they did end up amping up the damage of your Arcane Familiar by quite a decent bit, amping its damage by 250%. But previously Arcane Familiar did very little damage, so increasing 0 by 250 is likely going to be still very irrelevant. As for the Spec of Fire, they got a new talent called Ignition Burst, where Heat Shimmer causes your Scourge to become instant cast and do significantly more damage. Next we have the class of Monk, starting with a generalized change towards the Paralysis ability. Paralysis now may break to damage with a damage threshold, and it no longer immediately breaks to damage, which, like some of the other classes, it's going to be a little bit better for PvP content, but also some other situations like maybe Mythic Plus dungeons. Outside of this, Brewmaster Monks, like all the other tanks, sees a damage buff, though for Brewmaster it's only a 15% damage buff. Outside of that, Dave, or Invoke Nuzawa, has gotten buffed up a little bit to now absorb 40% of the stagger damage while active instead of 25%, and Invoke Nuzawa's Stomp damage is also being increased by roughly 22% or so to try to make Nuzawa a little bit stronger. Moving on to Mistweaver from Brewmaster, we got a couple of changes and talent redesigns. For Mistweaver, the talent of Giants with the Wind no longer grants you dodge, but instead reduces your physical damage taken with a stacking component until you eventually receive physical damage, which makes it a little bit better for PvE content. Like if an enemy does AoE physical hit on the rest of your party, you actually get some benefits out of it, but it does make it a little bit worse for PvP, where you can sometimes dodge physical attacks like a Rogue's Kidney Shot, for instance, which was kind of fun. For Mistweaver, we got a number of new talents, such as your Emperor's Favor, which adjusts Shaylun's gift to deal additional healing, be instant cast, but only heal a singular target, which gives you some options as to how you may end up using the Shaylun's gift burst heal ability. The ability of Jade Empowerment has been greatly redesigned, massively buffing Crackle and Jade Lightning's single target damage, increasing it by a ton, while also allowing it to cleave, though at a reduced effectiveness, making it much better as single target damage ability, but also having some cleave components for any additional enemies. Some of the lesser used talents such as Yulon Whisper has been buffed up by roughly 30%, if not double that, as of recently. Also, some of the combat healing capabilities from Mistweaver, like with abilities like Blackout Kick, those abilities now deal a little bit more damage in pure single target, but not as much in cleave, to make sure that it continues to have relevancy within pure single target situations while still being of benefit in AoE. Very, very similar to what we've seen with Jade Empowerment, just for your Blackout Kick cleave capabilities. Your Celestials now baseline are a 2-minute cooldown. You can still reduce them down from Gift of the Celestials down to 1 minute, but keep it at 2 minutes does make them a little bit more impactful, and they wanted to really juice up Invoke Yulon as well as Shiji to make sure that they're highly impactful by buffing the talent that buffs them with Jade Bond. Also, whenever you summon your Celestials, you put a Chi Cocoon on your allies. That Chi Cocoon now scales. If you have a 2-minute version, that cocoon is stronger. When you have a 1 minute, it's not as strong, to make using 2-minute cooldown Celestials just a little bit more usable for Mistweavers. Also, as a Mistweaver, they wanted to try to make Conduit Celestials a little bit better for the hybrid capability, so they increased the damage of Celestial Conduit greatly. So now, not only do you radiate a bunch of healing to your allies, but also quite a significant bit of damage to all enemies within 20 yards, with the damage and healing increase per target. When it comes to Windwalkers, they've adjusted a number of things, like increased your Mastery effectiveness by roughly 35% to make it a much better stat for you to invest points into. They also cleaned up a little bit of your gameplay by increasing the damage of your spinning crane kick. You no longer have a talent of Mark of the Crane or a passive of Mark of the Crane. That has been removed. Instead, buffing up your damage of your spinning crane kick based on punches and kicks that you do, natively, spinning crane kick now is just going to do 80% more damage, making it a lot easier to use in AoE content without you having to do some crazy big setup. Windwalkers also got a fun new ability called Slicing Wind, which replaces Flying Serpent Kick, though it is a capstone that's going to take a little bit of talent point investment to get. But it has an empowerment mechanic, and this is the first class outside of Evoker to gain an empowerment mechanic as a talent, where it does decent bit of damage, but the longer you hold it, the further you fly. So it can actually give you quite a bit of range, but even if you use it just an empowerment once so you don't go flying too far, it actually just gives you a short little hop so you don't have to completely displace yourself while dealing quite a significant bit of nature damage to all enemies in front of you with a 5-target soft cap. Talents like Zuen's Bond now give you a more dedicated cooldown reduction for your Zuen. Instead of function off your Storm, Earth, and Fire, it just gives you passive, baseline, consistent 30-second cooldown reduction off of your Zuen, which gives you a slightly different burst window. Talents like Last Emperor's Capatis have also been buffed up. Instead of increasing your Crackling Jade Lightning damage per stack by 200%, now it's up to 400, to try to make it a little bit more appealing going forward. And when playing Conduit with Celestials as a Windwalker, they also buffed up the interaction with Heart of the Jade Serpent. Previously, you needed to spend an X amount of chi before you could get this to proc with your Strike of the Windlord, but now it just procs with the Strike of the Windlord every single time, but just has a slightly shorter duration. And outside of this, for PvP content, monks get an adjustment to the Absolute Serenity talent, which previously prevented you to be immune to certain crowd control effects, though not all, but in 11.1, it's not going to make you immune to every crowd control effect in the game for the ability's duration. Mistweavers also get a brand new talent for PvP called Feather Feet. You may now cast while moving during Lighter Than Air, and its duration is now supposed to be 4 seconds, but it reads 6 seconds right now. Lighter Than Air is this buff right here. After you use a roll, you become lighter than air, allowing you to double jump to have a little dash for a short distance, but the cooldown of roll is slightly increased. So in PvP content, you will not want to double jump for a dash. Instead, you can now use that duration to cast spells while on the move, which can give you some positional capability to reset behind the pillar as you get a Soothe the Mist on an ally and pump some heals into them, which could be kind of interesting for a Mistweaver to have some movement while casting. From there, we move on to the Paladin, with the Blinding Light ability and Repentance, very similar to some of the other classes, now being broken on damage threshold instead of being broken immediately as soon as the enemy takes damage, which can again give you a little bit of viability within PvP, but also some PvE content. So from there, we can mostly move on and focus on Holy Caster Healer playstyle, and it looks like they're trying to buff up the caster aspects of the Holy Paladin, at least within PvE content. Abilities like Flash of Light and even Holy Light are now going to heal for a little bit more, with Flash of Light actually costing a little bit less mana, But the trade-off is Infusion of Light isn't going to be as effective. They're trying to make those basic casting spells like Holy Light and Flash of Light a little bit stronger on their own, instead of making them only viable once you have effects of Infusion of Light. So if you are in a situation where you need to hard cast a heal, it is going to be a little bit more effective, though it still is much more effective with Infusion of Light being active. The ability of your Holy Shock has also got buffed up by a significant bit, both in its healing greatly, but also a little bit in its overall damage. When it comes to hero specs for Holy specifically, Holy Lightsmith healing from Hammer and Anvil has been reduced by a decent bit. But also the talent of Blessed Assurance damage increase for your Crusader Strike has been greatly reduced, which also limits some of your damage capabilities. When it comes to Protection Paladin, like all the other tanks, this spec is also receiving a number of damage buffs. For Protection, we're seeing a 15% ability damage buff all across base abilities, but it also does come with some nerfs afterwards. Defensively, you're losing some value of Strength of Adversity, reducing your parry from 5% to 3% per stack of enemies hit by Avenger's Shield. Uther's Council talent also sees its cooldown reduction go from 30% reduced cooldown reduction down to 15%. And also damage of your Refining Fire reduced by 30%, even with this ability damage buff. Though they are trying to make Protection as a Templar a little bit more of a viable option going forward by giving it a little bit more of a care package anytime you engage with a Templar-based gameplay. With the talent of Undisputed Ruling, you also get to erupt Consecration beneath the target when you strike them, increasing your haste by 12% for 6 seconds, while additionally granting IF Tier 3 Holy Power to generate, to make it a little bit easier for you to line up Tier into a Hammer of Light into immediate setup in order to start being able to tank more effectively against the enemy target. When it comes to Retribution Paladin, we're not seeing too many changes. Primarily, we see a brand new addition of Divine Hammer, or rather a rework of Divine Hammer heading to 11.1, with the ability now having a 1-minute cooldown but still a 3 Holy Power cost. Now, Divine Hammer can now continue to keep spinning and attacking the target the more Holy Power you consume rather than the more Holy Power you generate, which matches the Retribution Paladin playstyle a little bit better and is a much easier talent to use, especially with the new upcoming tier set, which is going to allow you to dump a bunch of Holy Power spenders to keep that Divine Hammer rolling a little bit longer. Outside of that, they wanted to adjust Herald of the Sun and Templar for Retribution a little bit, with a number of adjustments, with things like Empyrean Hammers doing slightly less damage than normal. However, your big Hammer of Light ability can now benefit the talent of Final Reckoning, further increasing its damage, with the Final Reckoning itself also greatly increased in overall how much damage it can do to AoE targets. To make sure Herald of the Sun doesn't fall too far behind, however, they ended up increasing the effectiveness of Second Sunrise with bonus Divine Storms and Hammer Arrest, dealing additional damage. But also they wanted to increase the damage of Sun's avatar, increasing it by 50%, which will hopefully be of some significance to make Templar and Herald a little bit closer, but really tuning will decide which one of these two is going to be stronger. When it comes to Paladins, we got a number of new PvP talents for us to take a look at, such as Shining Revelation. The light reveals all enemies in stealth or invisible to you while under the effects of Divine Shield, which is your bubble, and this effect lingers for 20 more seconds after Divine Shield fades. So if you have the bubble, you'll have access to see where all these stealthy rogues are going to be, to make sure that you don't get caught out surprised after you pop out of your big defensive. Then we have the talent of Luminescence, which is now going to function with the talent of Light Bearer, allowing the transfer of the Light Bearer to be increased by up to 200% based on your current health, where the lower your health, the more healing you do towards your allies. And Holy Paladins now get access to Blessing of Spell Warding, which is going to be replacing a Blessing of Protection or make it interchangeable, but it does give you some anti-magic protection that's normally something that Protection and Retribution Paladins usually have access to. When it comes to the class of priest, we got a number of new changes for the spec of Discipline. One of the things I wanted to do initially is to make sure that the ability of Penance hits very hard, so the buff does damage and healing, but also give it some cooldown reduction based off of your overall stat of haste, to make it a little bit easier for you to be able to get this ability back quicker, and it ends up playing super well with the rest of the Disc Priest playstyle. There's also a number of talent changes and adjustments with brand new ones, like the tier set of Dragonflight in a form of Divine Procession being added, couple of new talents to empower the damage of your Shadow Word Pain and its effectiveness to replace the fiery dot that used to be there initially. being Purge the Wicked. Actually had to look it up, forgetting what the ability is, playing too much 11.1 PTR, honestly. And then replace your Rapture with Evangelism. Give it a big burst healing capability so it can be an emergency heal, but you do need to make sure to put Atonement on your allies. I am going to miss Rapture, of course, though. They also did make a ability of Ultimate Penitence easier to pick up, but it no longer has any cooldown reduction elements, so it's a fairly beefy, but a 4-minute cooldown that you'll have to play around with. They also adjusted the Void Summoner to reduce the cooldown of Shadow Fiend, Mindbender, and Void Rat to make it more consistent, but also have Disc Priest spend less time smiting to actively reduce the cooldown of any one of your pets, which plays actually pretty well when it comes to dungeon content. Also, they're trying to make Oracle and Void Weaver a little bit more even with a number of tunings for Void Weaver, which I imagine they're going to continue tuning it down a little bit. But for Oracle, they wanted to buff it up by a little bit with a new talent. That talent being Twin Sight, which has been adjusted, where you now fire 3 additional penance bolts. If you are healing an ally with penance, it'll fire damage bolts, and if you're damaging an enemy, it'll try to heal a nearby ally instead. So it gives you 2 penances for the price of 1. Then we have the spec of Holy Priest, which is also going through a number of adjustments with a pretty decent shakeup towards the talent tree, which is a lot to go over, but if I had to condense it specifically in a couple of bullet points, they wanted to increase the effectiveness of the ability of Prayer of Healing so it actually has some kind of value, which can now even benefit talents such as Lightweaver for additional AoE healing. They wanted to make sure that the Heal of Renew, which sometimes gets forgotten, has some sort of a value, so it is very possible to make a Renew focused build, or a build that could potentially build off of the healing that Renew provides. They also want to make the ability of Divine Hymn a little bit better and less unwieldy to work with. So you can either get a Gale Song for a stronger hymn or go for better cooldown reduction with Crescendo. Also, any of you that played Priest back in Legion will be happy to know that Restitution, your cheap death mechanic, is a little bit easier to pick up in the talent tree. So it may give you some capabilities to use that cheap death for, I guess, to bypass certain mechanics, whether it's boss or dungeon mechanics, which can be really fun and potentially gives Holy Priest some extra interesting, unique mechanic capabilities within group content, which I'm super excited about. They also adjusted your capstones a little bit by breaking Lightweaver away from Lightwell. They have Divine Image, a choice between Last and Words, which is a Dragonflight tier set, as well as Divine Word, and lastly, Answered Prayers. As for the spec of Shadow Priest, we're not seeing too many changes, mostly just buffs to try to make Void Weaver a little bit better. There's a number of tuning changes that are happening as well, which are going to be affecting Shadow Priest and Disc Priest, but in a very different ways. But they're trying to make Void Weaver a little bit stronger by buffing the effectiveness of Void Blast, slightly increasing the effectiveness of Inner Quietus, and also decent increase towards your Collapsing Void, which may end up synergizing potentially kind of good with the new tier set that's arriving and as part of the Season 2 content in 11.1. As for PvP changes, priests are getting a bunch of new rewards, talents rather, so it's not really new, but they're functioning very differently. Disc Priest Archangel, for example, allows you Evangelism to be increased its healing by 30%, becoming a much more burst healing ability, and Evangelism also increases your healing and absorption effects for the next 15 seconds by 20%, becoming a pretty sizable healing cooldown. Dark Archangel also has become more passive, working off of your Shadow Fiend or Mindbender, increasing your damage and the damage of your allies by decent bits, scaling depending on the pet you have, also scaling with the duration depending on the pet that you're currently running. Also, the talent of Trinity now works a lot better in massive group situations. Atonement duration increased by 10 seconds. Smite, Penance, and Void Blast now have a 30% reduced cast time when you have Atonement on 3 or more allies. So in a BJ Blitz situation, when you're using damage to heal allies with Atonement, it might be a little bit more valuable in that content specifically, or possibly in content like solo, BJ, or possibly in arena content as long as you're doing 3v3 type of content. When it comes to the class of Rogue, there really isn't much to take a look at. I will go over stuff in detail, but there really isn't much for the most part. Your abilities, like your Blind, for example, will have a damage threshold that it breaks on, so not instantly on damage, but damage may eventually break it. Also, same thing for Gouge, very similar to some of the other CC. It breaks on damage threshold, but not immediately on any damage that strikes the target, which could be good in content like PvP. They also buffed up Trickster by quite a decent bit, buffing the basic ability of Unseen Blade by a decent amount. Surprising Strikes buffed up by a lot, where they used to increase your crit strike damage of compound builds by 25%. Now it's up to 50%, which could be very, 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 very strong. They buffed up the proc chance of 1000 cuts to reset your Unseen Blade to get more hits with your Trickster, and they also buffed up Nimble Flurry for both Outlaw and Subtlety to be a little bit more effective. Also, the capstone of Coup de Grace, once you stack up with 4 Unseen Blades, you choose from your next Dispatch or Eviscerate. This ability used to charge you to the target, no longer charges you, so it's a little bit less unwieldy to use within PvE or PvP content. As for the spec of Assassination, we're not really seeing a lot of changes, just a damage buff for Crimson Tempest. They did end up buffing out Sure Precision to hit 8 targets, so Shift strikes 7 additional nearby enemies. Might have some play in certain content, but it's really hard to tell. They also buffed up Sudden Demise a little bit with this bleed damage, which is nice, but nothing super crazy or impactful for Assassination specifically. Outlaw is in a very similar boat. Not a lot of things changed. They did add a buff in Precise Cuts a little bit to be better at cleaving less than 8 targets in effectiveness. They did a buff in Sleight of Hand to work for your 2 set and your 5 chance, or I guess a 2 roll or a 5 roll for your Roll the Bones. Just make a Sleight of Hand a lot better, a lot more usable, because it's a little bit less useless now as an ability. And finally, Subtlety, which is getting some tuning for damage, but nothing super impactful for certain abilities. It's just like a raw aura buff by like 10% to account for the tier reset changes, but mostly nothing really new for Subtlety for the most part. The all rogues are actually continuing to not only not gain, but also lose a couple of things when it comes to PvP. You do gain one new PvP talent, which is Preemptive Maneuver. Feint decreases your damage taken by an additional 40% while stunned, and his energy cost reduced by 30%. So if you could pre-feint a stun, you basically become nearly unkillable, especially if you're running things like Elusiveness, which further increases the DR when feint is active, so you can make it a very strong defensive ability, but also kind of hard to land. The rogues did lose up a variety of different PvP talents, from Veil of Midnight, Enduring Brawler, Take Your Cut, and Shadowy Duel, all impactful talents that are now gone, with you having to now find some other talents to use within PvP combat. When it comes to the class of Shaman, one of the coolest things they've added for this spec off the bat is a new animation for their Lightning Bolt. Now, there's like a lot of times when they add a new animation and you don't really ever notice it, but this new Lightning Bolt looks absolutely amazing. You can see the lightning, how it kind of curses from the ground and shoots out like a proper bolt this time instead of like a line. I like it a lot. Not everybody's a fan of it, but I actually really like little changes like this when it comes to some of the classes and visual appeal. Besides this, Shamans do lose access to Ancestral Guidance. All 3 specs don't have it anymore, which is going to be somewhat impactful, but not by much. Enhancement and Elemental are being supplemented with additional hybrid healing through either combat abilities or things like Healing Stream Totem to be a little bit more effective, so there's at least that, so you won't really feel like you need it, but it is a dungeon or even a raid cooldown that you're now missing when it comes to group content, which is unfortunate. When it comes to Elemental, there really isn't much to talk about or to write home about, but they did end up adjusting it just a little. Talents like Deeply Rooted Elements, for instance, now have a proc rate based on your Maelstrom spend rather than anytime you use a Maelstrom ability. This makes talents such as Earthshock a little bit less likely to proc Maelstrom or Ascendance, but Elemental Blast that consumes more Maelstrom now scales better with it. So these two are a little bit more even, with Elemental Blast being a little bit more of an efficient option, so to say. The ability of Primordial Wave has been redesigned a little bit. Instead of giving you a primer for your Lava Burst to cleave to multiple targets, it instead immediately strikes enemies with a Primordial Wave, dealing elemental damage while granting your Lava Surge, hitting all the targets with a Flame Shock, but no longer giving you that combo for Lava Burst to cleave, but just being a cleave ability all on its own. Lastly, the ability of Ascendance, whether you proc it through an on-use or through a passive like Deeply Rooted, it will always Flame Shock and Lava Burst your priority target at all times to make sure that whoever you're targeting always takes the brunt of the damage, which is obviously going to add just a little bit more consistency. From there, we can move on to the spec of Enhancement, which gotten adjustments, and there's actually some really solid changes. First things first, I wanted to make sure that your Maelstrom spenders are not the entirety of your damage, and your Maelstrom builders can actually be functional, and you can spec into talents to further buff those builders. So things such as your Lava Lash, things such as your Storm Strike, even your Crash Lightning greatly increase in damage, things like your Ice Strike, all of these things got buffed up by a decent bit. To lower down your Maelstrom spenders, however, so you cast Lightning Bolts, Aerial Blast, Chain Lightning, Tempest, they didn't necessarily nerf the damage of all those abilities, but they did nerf Elemental Spirits a little bit. Elemental Spirits, whether they're Lightning Spirits, Frost, or Fire, now grant you 10% of the buff of the spirit of element that they are related to, so Nature, Frost, or Fire, but also 10% physical damage as well. So they never get you full magic buffs, but like portion magic, portion physical, to make sure those Maelstrom builders continue to be relevant, which do a lot of like Flame Strike damage, or Storm Strike damage, or Ice Strike damage, which has both elements in one. So it makes those Maelstrom builders just a little bit more impactful and makes certain combos like Totemic with the Hot Hand just a little bit more effective rather than focusing on Lightning Bolt on your target every single global that you get. A variety of other talents have also been updated, such as Molten Thunder, allowing Sundering a chance to reset its own cooldown. Sundering can also continue to keep rolling resets, but every time you use it, that chance goes slower and smaller and smaller. So if you're a fan of big RNG, you might be able to chain more than 3 back-to-back Sunders that I've been able to. I want to see 4 and potentially even 5, but I wonder if that's even doable, because the chances do get smaller and smaller and smaller. Talents like Lashing Flame now work for both Lava Lash and Sundering to increase the damage that enemies take by Flame Shock, which grants you a little bit better cleave AoE damage. And the ability of Primordial Wave, like for Elemental, also functions in a very similar way, dealing elemental damage to all targets with your Flame Shock instead of empowering your next Lightning Bolt to cleave to multiple targets. You can further empower Elemental Wave with Primordial Storm, however. After using Primordial Wave, it transforms into Primordial Storm for 15 seconds, which allows you to deal a bunch of Flame Strike, Frost Strike, and Storm Strike damage to all enemies around you while shooting Lightning Bolts and Chain Lightning at the targets. This is an ability that consumes Maelstrom weapons, so the more Maelstrom you spend, the harder that it hits. But like I said, we're trying to make those builders a little bit better and physical and magic damage better. With those abilities all being a strike damage, it has a physical component and a magical component, being Frost, Nature with Storm, or Fire with Flame. So it's a very interesting ability that deals a bunch of AoE damage while benefiting from both physical and magic damage buffs, which is interesting. Lastly, abilities like your Demons as well as Voltaic, Blaze procs all now benefit from your Mastery that can further increase their effectiveness based on one of your best stats that you usually invest into outside of just Haste, which is also a nice benefit. When it comes to Restoration Shamans, they're trying to somewhat clean up your rotation, because if you play a Shaman, you know this for sure, but you feel like there's a lot of keybinds for you to assign with so many different totems, so many different utility abilities. I mean, I myself am using the keybinds where I combine damage and healing abilities depending if I'm targeting an ally or an enemy. So a lot of players usually try to find ways to condense your keybinds and your bars as best as possible, and they're trying to help you out by removing Mana Tide Totem out of the game. You only have access to a Healing Tide. However, if you do want the effects of Mana Tide, you can now regain it with Mana Tide as a passive, where Healing Tide will now additionally restore mana to your allies, or it could be used with Spirit Walker's Title Totem to increase the effectiveness and mana cost and mana efficiency of your heals after dropping a Healing Tide Totem. So it's just one extra button for you to take off out of your keybinds. Outside of this, Restoration Shaman also got a number of new talents like Therazane's Resilience. Earth Shield and Water Shield no longer lose charges, but are now 115% more effective, so you no longer have to keep reapplying them on an ally or yourself, which can be nice in some situations. The talent of Whispering Waves actually gets swapped out from Primordial Wave, where a portion of your healing waves, and they're still tuning this number, a portion of your healing waves healing is now duplicated to every target with Riptide. So we'll see exactly how this works out in the future, because this didn't seem like a strong talent, but if it's tuned correctly, it could have some potential to have some major AoE cleave capabilities. Lastly, they want to buff up the damage of Resto in Conflict M+ specifically, so Acid Rain saw a fairly sizable damage increase over the past few weeks on the PTR. As for PvP talents, Shamans are getting a new one called Storm Conduit, available for Restoration and Elemental. Casting Lightning Bolt or Chain Lightning reduces the cooldown of your Wall, Gust of Wind, your Kick, and Nature Totems, with this number being slightly different, a little more favorable for Resto at 3 seconds and down to 1 second for Elemental. Interrupt duration reduced by 50% on Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning to try to encourage you to use your lightning-based spells and be less punished for getting interrupted on those casts. From there, we move on to the class of Warlock, which aren't getting too many new changes when it comes to general updates. They are adjusting the ability of Drain Life to do 100% more damage, therefore doing a bit more healing, so you are able to use it as a self-heal a little bit more aggressively, though it's not the most efficient heal, but it is being made a little bit better. As for the Spec of Affliction, they're adjusting the ability of Soul Rot, because a lot of players weren't utilizing the self-healing component of Soul Rot, where while Soul Rot is active, you can actually use Life Drain to AoE drain to heal yourself from multiple enemies, though in dungeon content and raid content, you're usually using your globals to deal damage while Soul Rot is active, because it's an extra dot that empowers some of your other dots. So most players weren't even utilizing the healing component, so now it'll naturally do a portion of its damage as a heal back to the Warlock to make sure you're still getting some of this soul leeching effect that it initially had as part of its class fantasy. For Affliction, they also buffed up the damage of your Summon Dark Glare greatly as of recent update, further increasing this damage by quite a bit baseline, but also even more for every dot effect that it extends. They buffed the damage of your Stable Affliction by quite a bit, trying to make it better for single target, and are buffing the damage of your Focus Malignancy to have yourself even better focus damage on targets with UA. With Affliction, depending on how it's tuned, might potentially have some really good focus damage for M+ content, but also Tier Set that allows you to spread your weight to multiple targets could be a very nasty combination. For the Spec of Demonology, we're not receiving too many new changes. With the talent of Doom, they are adjusting it, so now Doom can now be reduced in its duration for every soul shard spent through Hand of Gul'dan instead of through your demonic core consumptions, which is a little bit better. Also, with the talent of Demonic Calling, they're giving you a slightly higher chance to proc your free instacast Dreadstalkers, which makes it a little bit more usable. Next, we have the spec of Destruction, where they got a few new passive versions of active talents. Things like your Channel Demon Fire can now be swapped out to a passive version with Demonic Infusion, or Demon Fire Infusion. Periodic damage from your Wither or Immolate has a chance to fire Demon Fire Bolt at 100% effectiveness, and Incinerate has a 25% chance to do the same thing. And all these free procs to Demon Fire Bolts also gain all the value from talents that enhance Demon Fire damage, or channel Demon Fire damage to say the least. There's also a passive version of Dimensional Rift called Dimensional Ripper. Periodic damage from either Wither or your Immolate has a chance, 5% chance, to tear up in a Dimensional Rift, also gains all the benefits of Rift. Outside of this, when it comes to Warlocks in PvP, we're only getting a brand new talent of Bloodstones, which replaces your Hellstones with a Bloodstone, which instead of healing, increases your user's haste by quite a bit for 12 seconds. So it's a trades out defensive for an offensive ability that could have some really strong uses within PvP content. Lastly, we have the class of Warrior, which is getting a number of changes, mostly spec-specific changes. Though defensively, they are getting some adjustments with the talent of Reinforced Plates. No longer do they have access to a talent called Endurance Training. Instead, that talent is now being baked into Reinforced Plates to not only increase your armor, but also increase your stamina. But also, you're seeing some adjustment in the Warrior talent tree a little bit. The weapon specialization talents are now being moved to the left-hand side, kind of getting the Roar talent, the Thunderous Roar ability, and now you can put up to 2 points into these talents in order to be able to unlock those capstones, I guess, to try to shift the talent tree a little bit so you don't have too much of a different structure. This does move things like your Cool Strikes as well as Wild Strikes a little bit though. For the spec of Arms Warrior, we saw a variety of damage buffs, specifically for the ability of Mortal Strike. Technically, Mortal Strike can be amped up by other abilities like your Overpower, which can increase the damage of Mortal Strike and Cleave, but also things like your Executioner's Precision. And for a good bit, those buffs were so worth it, it was worth stacking them up before you would even use a global on a Mortal Strike. They wanted to adjust it by removing some of the power out of those stacking damage buffs and giving that damage directly to Mortal Strike, to basically give you a gameplay of as soon as Mortal Strike is off cooldown, you want to press it immediately, no matter how many buffs you have to overlap to empower the ability. Just kind of want to use it as often as possible and keep chopping away, which does help out the playstyle a little bit. They also did give you a new animation for both the ability of Closet Smash and your Warbreaker. And I would share what the animation looks like. However, the current animation on the PTR isn't what we'll be receiving, at least ideally, when it comes to 11.1 officially launching. They heard players' feedback and they said there will be a brand new animation because the current one just didn't quite meet expectations. So if I were to share with the current animation, which some players find underwhelming, it could give you a bad taste in your mouth for the warrior, at least when it comes to 11.1. So I would just wait until 11.1 launches and then see if they gave you a new animation or if it still has the original animation for you to play around with. Also, when it comes to Colossus, the ability of Execute no longer benefits from Colossus Might or can stack up Colossus Might. This was mostly a change so that you didn't replace your Mortal Strike with just spamming Executes back to back, which was more effective and does allow you to use Mortal Strike as a proper rotational ability. Just like Arms Warrior, Fury Warriors also saw a variety of different damage buffs all across the major combat abilities, with just about everything from your Bloodthirst, Raging Blow, Rampage, even Execute, and even some of the abilities empowered to things like your Reckless Abandon, all empowered to a variety of different damage amps, with also some buffs towards Mountain Thane specific playstyle like with your Thunderclap ability, but also your Whirlwind as well. Now, Fury Warriors do get a brand new talent modifying Avatar, and that is going to be new version of Titan's Torment. While Avatar is active, Rampage's rage cost is reduced by 20, allowing you to spam it more regularly, and Bloodthirst cooldown is reduced down to 1.5 seconds, allowing you to very aggressively Bloodthirst off of the enemy target, giving you a very spammy playstyle where your Rage Blow kind of goes over to the side and not getting spammed nearly as often. Fury Warriors also get a brand new version of Reckless Abandon, which changes up Recklessness completely. You no longer get Reckless Abandon procs every time you use your Rampage, but now it's tied to your Recklessness ability. Activated Recklessness generates future Rage, and while Recklessness is active, Raging Blow and Bloodthirst are transformed into Crushing Blow and Bloodbath, which also got changed. Crushing Blow not only does additional damage, but now has damage critical strike increase to it, so when it crits, it does even more and generates more rage. Bloodbath now also puts a bleed on your target that continues to stack basically infinitely, but with a limited duration of Recklessness, eventually that bleed is going to fall out, but it's a bleed that you can continue to stack over and over and over against the target while dealing additional physical damage. However, because Reckless Abandon and the way it functions, it only works while Recklessness is active, so you can no longer just keep proccing these empowered versions of Bloodbath and Crushing Blow. So you give Recklessness either a very strong 1.5 minute burst window, or you can play a more passive version with Anger Management for a bit more sustained damage. This also does make talents such as Depths of Insanity giving you a longer duration a little bit more impactful with Recklessness, Abandon, as well as your Unbridled Ferocity giving you a chance to pop Recklessness does give you a short momentary access to the Recklessness Abandon version of the ability, though it is a very, very low RNG chance for it, which changes the dynamic of how you can play Fury Warrior either as an all-out bursty berserker or to go a little bit more sustained heavy with a different set of abilities. When it comes to Protection Warriors, just like all the other things, they're also receiving a damage buff all across the board, with Protection Warriors getting a 20% damage buff for the patch 11.1. They also wanted to slow down the generation of your rage as a Protection Warrior with the resets of Strategists, and for the most part they pulled back on a lot of this rage generation reductions, but not all of them. So Protection Warrior may feel a little bit sluggish, but not by too much, since players did do a lot of feedback gathering over in the PTR to let them know that, hey, you're slowing this thing down way too much and it's now starting to feel a little too sluggish, so they pulled back on some of those changes. Though we do still have things like Impenetrable Wall no longer increases rage generated by ability of Shield Slam, as well as with Boom and Voice, you only generate 20 rage instead of 30 rage whenever you use Demoralizing Shout, and Champion's Bulwark no longer increases the amount of rage you generate with the Shield Charge ability. So they did find ways to reduce some of your rage generation to slow down the gameplay, but through other means at the very least. Also, talents like Violent Outbursts can now be tracked as part of your personal resource to make it a little bit easier for you to know exactly when Violent Outburst is going to be capped up and is going to be in use. The same thing can be said about Ignore Pain. Normally, Ignore Pain does have a cap of how many millions of damage you can absorb, so you can reach that cap super easily and keep spending rage, but not getting any more rage cap. So now Ignore Pain is going to have a little number telling you how close it is to being capped out. So once you hit that Ignore Pain cap, you can just start spending your rage on every other ability once Ignore Pain hits its cap. And you can see when that cap starts to drop when you're taking heavy damage, so now you know when you can start using Ignore Pain more aggressively. Previously, Prot Warriors could do this with usage of weak auras, but now even a player that's new to Prot Warriors should be able to see the numbers and judge just how much damage they're taking, depending on how quickly they're losing their ignore pain. Also, they increase the amount of damage that ignore pain can now ignore, increasing it by 30% to be a much better of a shielding capability. Lastly, they also reduce the cooldown of shield wall down to 3 minutes. I do have it a little bit lower to 2.9 with the talent, but they did reduce it a little bit since you're no longer going to be churning through rage nearly as quickly. When it comes to PvP, Warriors got a number of PvP talents, specifically Arms and Fury. One of the talents is a new one called Berserker's Roar, which replaces Berserker's Shout on a 1-minute cooldown, allowing you to go berserk, removing and granting immunity to fear, sap, and incapacitation effects for 6 seconds. Also reduces the duration of the next crowd control effect within 15 seconds by 50% on group members within 30 yards, which grants you quite a nice bit of that group utility within PvP content. Always love to see that. Dragon Charge is another talent that now can be applied for Arms and Fury. Replacing Heroic Leap allows you to charge forward, knocking all the enemies back. If you press the ability again, it does stop the charge, so you no longer have to keep charging off of a cliff, which happens to Warriors sometimes. But you can just kind of control the ability a little bit better while you use it to displace enemies, which may be amazing in content like BG Blitz to barrel through an enemy team. For Arms Warrior, Sharper Blade has gotten adjusted to be a bit more passive. Colossal Smash now causes your next Mortar Strike to deal additional damage and reduce the healing of the target by 50% for 4 seconds instead of having to actively use Sharpen Blade ability. And lastly, for Fury Warriors, what not initially a buff, Death Wish now causes the character to also grow larger. So it doesn't actually increase your damage or damage taken or anything like that. It just makes the character slightly bigger every time you use the ability of Death Wish. To some degree, it can actually be a bit of a nerf, because at some point players are going to see how a Fury Warrior is visually growing stronger, but also more vulnerable with the Death Wish ability. Since they'll be larger than everybody else, they'll stand out more and will probably end up likely being a target of focus in the future BG Blitz. As always though, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys did enjoy this video. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join our Discord community, probably the best place to discuss with everybody else regarding all of the newest updates that arrive for the patch 11.1. Also, let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.